So I want to talk to you about how teachers' recommendations really matter in college admissions before the pandemic, but now much even more than before, right? Because they do not have that extra piece of information. The colleges don't know about your test scores if you don't have a chance to take it, or if you took it and you chose to not submit your score. So having that teacher recommendation is really going to give them that extra dimension to really know about you. Another reason that the teacher's recommendations sometimes get more weight is that it's something that you really can't control as a student as much, right? You can control your essay, right? You can get help writing your essay. You can have many people read it. You can study for a test, right? You can go to a prep course, to get a better score on your test, right? What else? Like you can have activities, right? You can do activities or choose to do different activities, choose to do sports or music or art. Like those are all things that you sort of can control. Whereas the teachers, it's really an independent assessment of the student that really is mostly out of the control of the student. And that gives a much more honest opinion or an honest evaluation of the student compared to anything else that you would submit, right? Like your transcript, you can choose what classes you're taking. All those things I feel like it's just more in your control, right? Whereas the teacher recommendation is that it's that honest evaluation of who you are as a student. It really speaks to number one, what kind of student are you, right? How academically inclined are you? Like, are you trying hard? Are you participating in class? That kind of thing. Second is actually how well do you connect with your teachers, right? You could be a really good student, but if you don't really communicate with your teachers, then that teacher recommendation may not show as good of a reflection of who you are, right? So it's kind of that both sides. So we all agree that teacher recommendations are important, okay? And we understand why they're important, right? So just the basics, you will need, for most colleges, you will need at least 2 teacher recommendations. And I usually recommend, kind of depends on what your major is, but I really recommend having one of those teachers be on either like a math or a science side and a different teacher on like the humanities or English, history, social sciences side. So it's nice to show that the 2 sides, you can have one teacher from one side and one teacher from a different side. Of course, if you're applying for a science heavy major like engineering or any of the sciences, and you really want to show your if you really want to show like you're just like really into science, or if you really love your teachers and they really know you well, then maybe you want to have like one math teacher and one science teacher, right? So that could be a possibility as well. But those are sort of like individual cases, and if you have questions about that, we can certainly talk about that tonight. But normally I recommend one math or science and one English or social studies. And then there's also a third recommendation that you can get, and that usually can come from either it's called like the other recommendation, right? And you can get that from a coach, a sports coach. It could be an extracurricular club leader type person. It could be a pastor. It could be somebody in the community, someone that you worked with for volunteering, or it could be a boss from a job or an internship that you did. So it could be somebody outside of your school or within your school that's not necessarily your teacher. So that person can give a different dimension. And I really like that. It can show, it can be any teachers you had in high school, right? I really think that it is important to get that third recommendation for many schools, because you can write about your activities, you can write about all those things that you have done, but to have another person really vouch and say, this person made this contribution to my organization or to the club or to the sport or whatever it is, or this person has grown, through that experience, that's really valuable, right? It can be any teachers you had in high school, correct? However, I would strongly recommend that you pick a teacher from either your junior year or your senior year. And my first choice usually would be your junior year. So juniors, this is where you should listen, right? If you're a junior, this year is actually very key for you. Usually I recommend for juniors to ask for their teacher recommendations in the spring or early summer of their junior year. So near the end of your junior year, you should be asking your teachers for your recommendation. And the reason is because, if that teacher is not going to be teaching you in senior year, you're most likely going to be getting a new teacher for senior year. And that new teacher only has 1 or 2 months or 3 months, at most, to give an evaluation of your performance. So, and whereas the junior year teacher, they have literally the whole entire junior year to evaluate you. So I really strongly recommend a junior year teacher. And then the second recommendation, if you don't have a good teacher in your junior year, then that would be, I would say, a senior year teacher would be second best. However, if you don't have, if you know a teacher from your sophomore year or freshman year that you really connected with, that you had a history with, or maybe that teacher taught you more than 1 year, that's also okay. But I would just keep in mind that you don't want to go back too far, because if you're asking your freshman year teacher, right, or sophomore year teacher, first of all, they're probably not remembering, what exactly you did or how it all happened. And then you also have changed, right? So if you ask a teacher from freshman or sophomore year, that their assessment may not be as accurate as, who you are today. Okay, so another thing I want to mention was that this year, because of test optional, that other recommendation that I was just talking about, where it could come from a coach or, like a club advisor or somebody like that, for some students, it might be wise, instead of picking a community service or a coach kind of person, for some students, it might be wise to pick a third teacher. Okay, so this kind of depends on your personal circumstance, but I would say, because we don't have that test score, having another teacher recommendation may be really helpful to you. So one example might be if you're an international student, the question of like your English proficiency might be a question. So if you wanted to pick like a science and a math teacher already for your 2 teachers, but then it might be wise to pick a third teacher who's an English teacher, so that English teacher, whether it's a regular English teacher or an ESL teacher, they can write about and assess your English abilities. Or, if you had certain classes, you didn't have great grades in, right? Maybe you had some grades that weren't looking so good. Having a teacher recommendation from those areas might be helpful and shed some light on maybe why, your grades weren't as good in that area. But I'd be glad to talk to you about specifics on that if you want. But I just think that this year in particular, for some students, it might be wise to pick an actual academic teacher for that third recommendation rather than that community, kind of advisor type person. But I'll move on to the counselor recommendation. So we got the 2 teachers, the 1 outside or other recommendation, which could be a teacher, but doesn't have to be. And another one that is the counselor recommendation. So that would be your high school counselor, or for some schools, if you don't have a high school counselor, or if that's not the name of that position, it could be an advisor or assistant principal or principal. This one is a little bit tough sometimes because one, a lot of students don't get a lot of time with a high school counselor just because one counselor might be looking after 500 kids or something like that. Um, and then also, you just don't like schedule that time to go see them, or you might see them once, in a whole year. So how are they supposed to write a recommendation for you? Um, so there's a couple, so it applies to teachers too, but I think for counselors especially, that I would encourage you as a student, if you are a senior, and also if you're a junior or younger, to go see your counselor, right? So if you are a senior and you don't know your counselor, or if your counselor doesn't know you, definitely this is a great time to schedule a time with your counselor, to go see your counselor, set up a meeting. A lot of schools will do this automatically, like they will do that for you, and you'll have that meeting, right? Maybe sometimes it's with your parents, sometimes it's without your parents. Some schools do this automatically, but if your school doesn't automatically do this, then I would encourage you to be enthusiastic and to be assertive and to schedule that appointment for yourself. Because most likely, if you don't do that for yourself, they may not necessarily do it for you, right? So you might have a counselor who's writing a recommendation for you, who has never even talked to you, which would not be a good idea. Okay, and some schools will actually ask for you to fill out a form that says, what are the schools you're applying to? What are your major, thoughts about major choices? What are your activities? And they might ask some personal questions about, to get to know you a little bit better, right? Some schools will have that form. If your school does not have that form, I would encourage you to write it down, right? Kind of have your mini resume. It doesn't have to be super neat or super formal, but just maybe one piece of paper that has your name on it. You probably don't really need to put your courses because your counselor should already have that in their database, but you should put just a little bit about yourself, maybe a paragraph about who you are, where you're from, what are the things that you like to do, and then what are some of the clubs and activities that you have done. What are some colleges that you're thinking about applying to? It doesn't have to be, set in stone, but just some of my top choices for college, for example, and then some top major choices. And if you know career direction, whether you want to do med school, law school, dental school, anything like that, if you know, you can put that in there if you have that interest. But if you don't know, that's okay. You don't have to put it down. But having that one sheet written down, I think is really good idea for both your counselor as well as your teachers, so that they have that, in hand when they're ready to write for you, and they're not thinking about, oh yeah, where's this person from, or who's this person again, especially for the teachers, or I'm sorry, especially for the counselors, because they probably don't spend as much time with you. Like your teachers, you probably see them, every day or every other day or something like that. But the counselors are not going to see you as often. So having that piece of paper would be very important. Okay, so I would encourage you to prepare that. And then that's also an exercise, right? Because that's really what should go into your application anyway, right? So having that one piece of paper would be good to prepare for your teachers as well. So have that for the counselors, the teachers, and the other recommender. So it's just one sheet, get it done, and all four people can have it. Okay. And again, that third other recommendation is not required. Most schools do not require that. It's just an optional person. But if you do have a person who know you well outside of academics, I would encourage you to submit that, right? And it would make a difference sometimes in some schools, but not every school. Some schools don't even recommend, they don't even take any recommendations, right? But, what we're talking about right now for the schools that do look at recommendations, that's kind of the drill. Okay. Do we need counselor letter if counselor doesn't like me or appreciate my art? Yeah, so We do definitely need a counselor letter. In almost every school that I know, you will need a counselor letter, okay? And that's the purpose for that is really they want to know you as a person, as a community member in your school. So the teacher is going to evaluate you on like how good of a student you are. Like, are you turning your homework? Are you doing good on tests? Are you interacting with other classmates? Are you asking questions and answering questions in class? You know, those are the type of things that the teacher would talk about. Whereas if it's a counselor, that person might say, you know, does this person join clubs? Does this person lead to show leadership ability in the school? Does this person help other students? Do they do tutoring? You know, do they try to make the school a better place? Does this person take advantage of all the activities or some of the activities or the resources that are at the school? Does the student have good relationships with their peers and their teachers? Does the student get in trouble, right? That kind of thing. So the counselor is giving you a more non-academic, if you will, sort of evaluation for the student. So most schools will require that counselor letter, which is also why, you know, if you're a junior or a senior, or a freshman or a sophomore, right? To cultivate that relationship with a counselor is really important. And some schools, the counselor follows you, right? You have the same counselor freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, and senior year. That counselor will follow you. But not all schools are like that, right? Some schools, they'll have a dedicated counselor for, you know, say freshman year, and then sophomore year you'll get a totally new person, and then junior year you'll get a totally new person again, and then senior it might be a totally new person again, right? So in that situation, how do you deal with that? So maybe, you know, if that person, if your junior year counselor didn't like you, maybe that's good if you're getting a new person, right? But it might not be good if I was getting trouble freshman. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so if if you have a new counselor, that's a new opportunity for you to make a good impression and talk to them. And I honestly don't think that counselors get into the job of being a counselor and then dislike students, right? I think their I think their job is to help students to find their path. And if they're not liking their job, they probably shouldn't be a counselor, right? So I think, you know, as a student, figure out why, you know, figure out what's going on. You know, if you're not talking to a counselor, that might be one of the problems. If you're talking to them and they're just like being mean to you and they're not, you know, sharing or they're not being nice to you, ask them, you know, ask them like what you can do. Say, you know, I'm sensing that, like you're not being very supportive of me, right? That might be something you could say. You could definitely want to be respectful, but you could also ask for help. And I think usually if you ask for help, they're likely to help you, right? You could say, you know, my goal is, right, to do blah, blah, blah. Can you help me achieve this goal, right? How can you help me? What can I do to achieve this goal? And what resources does this school have to help me achieve that goal, right? And most of the time you'll find that the counselor will say, okay, you need to do better in this class, or you need to take this other course, or you should do this, you know, they'll give you some suggestions. And I think all you need to do is really ask for some suggestions on, you know, how to, you know, get to the goal that you want to get to, right? Does that make sense? So yeah, so if you don't have if you have a counselor who doesn't like you and you don't have a new counselor, unfortunately, you know, that's not something that's really within your control. What is within your control is how you deal with that relationship. And that actually speaks volumes to the colleges as well. Because if you have a difficult relationship with someone, whether it's a counselor, whether it's a teacher, or a student, a peer, or a boss, you know, somebody that you're working with that is just not a great relationship, you will continue to have those relationships. You will continue to have conflict and problems, right? Everyone does. Everyone, as you go to college, as you go to work, you will continue to have issues, right? That's basically guaranteed that you will have problems, with working with people. Every person, every person will have issues, okay, like dealing with people. But the question is, how do we move past it? How do we solve those problems? How do we get to a point where we can work towards the same goal? And that's something, for you to grow in and for you to figure out. Okay, so as you work through that, that's how also the counselor or the teacher can write about your growth, because they can say, this student used to be like this, and then they tried hard, and then they did this, right? Or they can even say, this student surprised me by doing this, right? So all of that can be really positive, okay? So let's go back a little bit to asking for recommendations. So if you have already asked for recommendations, that's awesome, that's great. If you have asked and you haven't given them that like one piece of paper that tells them something about you, still do that, right? Still, it's not too late to do that. Go back and say, thank you for agreeing to write my recommendation letter. Here's a little bit about me. Give that paper to them. And I would also recommend, if you have already asked your teacher, and if you haven't actually had a meeting with that teacher, do have a meeting. Okay, so all you need to do is request a 10 to 15-minute meeting with your teacher. So this could be during office hours, this could be before school, after school, during lunch or something. This cannot be right after your class. Okay, so it's not like going up to your teacher after class and saying, hey, can I talk to you right now? Okay, that is not acceptable, because that teacher can be busy going to the next thing, or there could be other students around that would make the teacher uncomfortable and not able to really have that candid conversation with you. So I would recommend having that meeting with your teacher. Okay, and in that meeting, basically talk to that teacher about like what you want to study, what are your priorities, what schools you want to go to. Maybe remind that teacher, some of the things that you learned in that class that may be either academic or non-academic, that will help that teacher remember what to say about you, okay? Do you have any specific suggestions about how to format or write the brag sheet? Oh, I like that name, the brag sheet. I don't really have specific recommendations. I mean, I would say, there's lots of templates online. If you search resume template, you can find a template online. For a lot of the students who are working one-on-one with me, we will work on that brag sheet together. But, like in terms of format, like you can just pick one of those resume formats, that's totally fine. Or it could be just completely your own, right? I think, I think it depends on who you are and what works for you, but usually like a small paragraph, like about who you are, what you want to do, right? What schools you want to go to, what major you want to go to, just a quick summary, like a executive summary, if you will, right, about yourself. And then maybe like a section, just like bullet points about some activities or sports or music, whatever you did. And then maybe like a list of colleges that you want to go to or majors that you want to do or something like that will be fine. I mean, I would say keep it simple. It doesn't have to be, super long, like you're not a PhD student, so you don't have to have like a bunch of things on there. And sometimes, having it be simple is better than having it be really complicated and hard to read. So I would keep it readable, bullet points, small paragraph. That would be my suggestion. How can you tell if a teacher wants to write a recommendation letter for you? That's a good question. So who should you ask, right? I will say that, first of all, it doesn't have to be a teacher where you got the best grade in, right? You don't have to say, well, I got a, not so great grade in this class, I shouldn't ask this teacher. Not necessarily. And I think it should be a class that you tried hard in, right? It shouldn't be a class that you just coasted and did the minimal things, right? That should not be that class. It should be a class that you really applied yourself and you tried hard and it showed. Maybe it's a class that where you had to work in a group, right? Maybe you had to done a group project, and the teacher could observe you like in that group. Maybe it's a class that you did a presentation in, right? That the teacher can observe sort of your presentation skills or how you resolve the conflict in that class. Or maybe it's a class where you initially struggled, but then you got extra help from the teacher and that teacher helped you and then you did better, right? So I think all of those will be good. Also, if it's a class that, it could also be a class where you were very active and participated in class. Maybe you raised a lot of questions in class and maybe you answered a lot of questions and really participated in the discussion in that class. I think all of those will be really good measures to kind of think about like what kind of teacher who wants to write a recommendation letter for you. I think you sort of can tell like from the gut feeling. I think every teacher, they want to write a good letter for you, but not every teacher is necessarily able to as well. So I think I hear a lot about people who say, oh, I want to get like my English teacher to write it because I'm sure she's going to write a beautiful letter. It's going to be grammatically correct. It's going to be, fancy words and beautiful. It doesn't have to be, right? It really doesn't have to be. The application is not evaluating the quality of your teacher's writing. Okay, it's not evaluating the quality of your teacher's writing. The application will evaluate the quality of your essay, okay, but not your teacher's letter. So your teacher's letter could be bad grammar, it could be bad spelling, it could be whatever, but the content is what's important, okay? So if you have a coach or a math teacher or somebody who's like really not good at writing, but they can very briefly talk to the college about your contribution, about an honest evaluation of your character, right? Like all of those things, like even if it's bad grammar or whatever, like who cares? We don't really care. As long as they're giving a very convincing and honest evaluation of you, then that's what's important. If you don't really know what you want to study in college, do you suggest getting a recommendation letter from one STEM and one humanities teacher or something else? Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you don't know, if you're really undecided about what you want to study, it's probably wise to get a recommendation letter from like a math science side and then one letter from your humanities teacher. I think that would be a good way to go. However, definitely think about like what I was just talking about, like your participation in class, right? If you are super participating in all of your humanities classes and you have a great relationship with your English teacher and history teacher, but you didn't do well in STEM and you really didn't try hard in any of those like math or science classes, then maybe it's good to get one from your English teacher and history teacher, right? So I think it kind of depends. If you're pretty much like all the teachers like you and they're all good and you kind of were pretty even in both STEM and humanities, then yeah, I think if you don't know what you're going to study, I would definitely pick one from each side, just so that as you're getting into college, the college can say, oh, this person, they don't know what they want to study. It seems like they can study anything, right? But if you get like a teacher from just math and science and you don't have any recommendations from English, right, then they may say, well, if this person doesn't know what they want to study, they seem like really good at math and science, but if they don't end up doing that, I don't know how well they're going to do like in terms of humanity. So there might be a question there. But that, you know, they look at the grades as well and test scores if you have them as well. So it's kind of all looking at it all together in one package. But yeah, I think in general, I would recommend one from each side. I just want to say that, you know, reiterate this year more than any other year, please, please, please work on those teacher recommendations. I will send out a link later in the emails that actually has the link to the Common App teacher recommendation form that they fill out. So in case you didn't know this, there's actually a form that they fill out in addition to the letter, okay? So just so you're aware that in that form, they're going to be rating you in a couple of the different categories. So I will send that out link later. But, you know, just please, please work on your teacher recommendations, communicate with your teacher as much as you can, talk with your counselors. It's very important this year.